For this episode, we are joined by the CEO of Teach for India, Shaheen Mistri. If we could begin with your journey into the educational space and then what you understand that space to be, what its purpose should be.
Sure. So my journey started pretty young. I was 18 in university in the US and dropped out really on a very strong instinct and a trip back to India one day to walk into a large low-income community and start teaching. So that's where my journey began. I at that time spent a lot of time in the communities teaching, founded an organization called Akanksha while I was still in college, and then spent many years, about 17 years, building Akanksha. Many of those years I spent in a classroom with kids, spent a lot of time in communities, and then built out the organization. And then 17 years later, I think saw really dramatic shifts in kids because of the power of education, and felt very compelled to ask what we could do at scale, given India's scale. And then started Teach for India now 10, almost 11 years ago. And I've spent the last decade sort of building Teach for India out. And what was the second part of your question? The purpose of education?
Yeah, so what do you understand it to mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is a question that is a important and evolving one to keep asking, and has parts of it I think have remained very constant right from when I first was a young teacher till today, and then parts of it have evolved. But I think today, if you ask me, I think education is about self, other, and world. And so in the self bucket, education is about really discovering who you are, your purpose in the world, the life you want to lead, the livelihood you want, the lifestyle you want, and really like learning the skills and mindsets to unleash your fullest potential in the world. I think in the other bucket, it's really around how do you do that in a way that is respectful and loving of those around you? How do you learn to listen and hold different perspectives? How do you operate with love in the world? And then in the world bucket, I think it's very much around how do you deepen your understanding of the many complex issues in the world. How do you unleash your imagination to create solutions and to make the world a better place for everybody? So in my mind, that's what like the purpose of education has evolved to.
To the self other world. Like when it comes to Teach for India itself and other organizations and work you've done, what do you see as the main objective of those organizations? For instance, Teach for India, what's the main role of that organization?
Yeah. So Teach for India has a singular focus on leadership development. Our big belief is that for some of the world's greatest problems to be solved, educational inequity being one of them, we need leadership at all levels of the system working collectively to address that problem. And so Teach for India very simply is trying to build a growing movement of leaders who are committed to ending educational inequity in India by working across all different levels of the education system.
Mm-hmm. And when these different leaders are working in those educational spaces, or in schools and with other partners which you're working alongside, is there a particular ethos that you would like them to be implementing? Is there some particular ethic or some kind of an educational space that you are particularly championing?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think that there's any silver bullet solution to solving educational inequity. So I do think it's going to take very, very diverse perspectives and actions and people to make this happen. Having said that, so Teach for India is sort of, you can see the organization in two parts. The first part is a common experience that all of our fellows go through, which is a 2-year on the ground full-time teaching experience. And there, I think there's a very strong ethos of a holistic education, of trying to give your children the kind of expanded purpose of education that we talked about a little bit earlier. There's also a very deep belief that teaching is leadership, that what it takes to be a great teacher in a classroom, the ability to set vision, meet kids where they are, execute effectively, reflect, continuously work, all of those are principles of great leadership. And so by practicing teaching, especially in a challenging context, you grow as a leader. So I think that's the fellowship. And then the second part of Teach for India is the alumni movement. And there really, while we want our alumni to work as collectively as possible so that they can just accelerate their impact, we understand that like they need to just be doing very, very diverse and different things to be able to address the issue at different levels. We need some of our alumni staying in the corporate sector, channeling funding towards education. We need others staying on the ground as teachers and school leaders. We need others working in government on education policy. So in that sense, I think the common ethos is just the definition of an excellent education, and how the process of education needs to be one that is in partnership with students, that encourages student voice, that is filled with love and joy as part of the education journey. But again, the diversity of things that our alumni do is something we would definitely continue to encourage.
With regards to the fact that your alumni go into different spaces, not necessarily teaching, but they also, like you're saying, they might work on funding and other things. If we could address some of those challenges then when it comes to addressing educational inequities and other things that Teach for India aims to address, what do you see as the main challenges structurally within the Indian system to address some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. It's such a big question. I think I mean, if you look at all levels of the system, changes and shifts are needed from talent, which I would say would be like my number one answer to your question, that like things just don't shift unless the right people are in the right positions. And so is teaching aspirational enough in our country? Are we valuing our teachers enough? Are we developing them enough? Are we giving them the importance that they deserve as people that are really holding our nation's potential in their hands? So I think there's one whole set of structural shifts, changes, resources with regard to teachers themselves. I think there's a second whole bundle of shifts with regard to policies and curriculum around like what we're teaching, right? So today in India, still education is very much about a competitive race to an exam to get a job. And whereas that is a very important part of education, it is a part of education. So I think until we broaden and widen what education actually is, we're not going to really shift education. That links directly to structural changes needed at the examination level as well, because schools are going to deliver what eventually is tested. And so how do we make testing much more holistic, much more continuous? Again, it's there in the NCF, and the vision in India is for it to be there, but I think in implementation it breaks down. And then of course multiple breakdowns in just implementation across the board and bureaucracy. So I think many challenges, but if you were to ask me like what's the one thing I would bet on, it's just like infusing talent into the system that is motivated, fresh, passionate, and really building capacity of people in the system, not just in their skills and knowledge, but really in their mindsets and motivation as well.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to trying to persuade other stakeholders in the educational space, so politicians, for instance, or other charities and organizations that you're working with in order to achieve these reforms and solutions that you mentioned, how do you go about that? How do you persuade for these changes? Because if they are so structural, what's the route to bringing more people into the dialogue, into the conversation?
Yeah. So Teach for India, the organization, and our alumni movement, I would answer that slightly differently for both. So for the organization, I think we're just big believers in like proof points.
Mm.
So can we have like enough classrooms that are just like blowing it out of the park in terms of the quality of education? Can we be turning out and developing educational leaders that just think very, very differently in terms of what kids are capable of, what education can look like? So influence through just putting our heads down, doing the work, and sharing a lot of the stories of that work, I think is the approach that we take as an organization. I think for our alumni, and that's really where the power of our work lies in this growing group of now 3,500 alumni out there working in education. They are working really to influence at multiple different levels. So be it alumni who are rewriting textbooks that are touching all kids across the state, or alumni that are working directly in government and policy and again impacting kids at scale, or alumni who continue to be proof points who are working on more direct impact with kids. So I think the influence is happening in many, many different ways and different levels. And today, of course, with social media and just us in general being so much more connected as a world, there's a lot more like learning and sharing that is possible instantaneously. So we not only look within India, but also like Teach for All is a global network of 53 countries. And there's a lot of cross-learning, sharing, proof points, ideas, learning across the world that's happening as well.
I'm just wondering about the civic culture that you're producing in these educational spaces. So say all these reforms come into being, that you do address all the inequities across the country, and you produce what you think is ideal. What does that look and feel like to you? What would that mini utopia actually resemble in any ways? What kind of emotions would you attach to it? I'm wondering if you've thought about this.
When you say mini utopia, at what level are you talking about? Like, what would the world look like, or what would our people
I'm
look
thinking
like?
about your educational spaces, if they are what you crave them to be, and then as a
Got
consequence, societies, what kind of feelings would you associate with that moment?
it. Got it. So we've started talking much more at Teach for India about 8 C's that we feel all children should learn and embody, but also are sort of a constant evolution for all of us. So the first is consciousness. Like, how do I develop a deeper awareness again of self, other, and world? And reflection is a really important tool. So you'll see classrooms where kids are asked to really think deeply about the experiences that they've had. Creativity and critical thinking as 2 really important C's, given just the pace of change in the world, the number of problems, the need to be solution oriented, optimistic, original. Those are our 2 other C's. Communication being just critical in today's world, and communication from a perspective of being able to express myself, to stand up for what I believe in, to raise my voice, collaboration and compassion. So how do I care for others in this world? How do I also care for myself in a world that feels very overwhelming? And how do I work with others for change? And curiosity in today's world where, really anything we want is a button away from us. How do we get kids excited about seeking knowledge, like getting access to the best possible ideas, people they can from around the world? So we're building a lot of our leadership development framework for our fellows as well as for our students around these 8 C's.
Mhm. And these 8 C's, were they come into being, would produce a culture and environment which you think is
I think what they'll produce is children who get out of poverty. That's a huge, huge outcome for us. Like, in some ways, my colleagues said this the other day, like we work at the level of Maslow's and we also work at the level of Bloom's, right? So how can TFI hold both of those? So the 8Cs will enable you to get a livelihood. It will enable you to discover your purpose and self. The 8Cs will also help you operate with love and respect for others. And the 8Cs will help you be a change maker for a better world. So again, the 8Cs loop back to that original purpose of education that we spoke about a little bit earlier. I think that would be our vision. Like if every kid really knows who they are, what they want to do, or has the skills to be able to do that, but also is uplifting others around them at the same time and making the world better. The hope is that the 8Cs really lead directly to kids who embody those outcomes.
Just to bring this all together then for a final question. When it comes to the wider public and people who are interested in the educational space but not necessarily involved in it as a teacher, what kind of advice would you be giving to them? What kind of things should they be doing? What kind of things should they be thinking about? What's their role in bringing about some of these changes?
Yeah, I mean, because it's the work of education, it pretty much touches everybody's life in some way or the other, whether you're a parent or a uncle, aunt, whatever. So, I mean, I feel like just expanding how we think about the power of education, and not thinking about it narrowly, but really believing that every child, irrespective of background, wherever they are in the world, like deserves the fullest kind of education, and doing whatever you can in your own way towards that goal. um yeah, that's what I would say.
So there's agency with each person in the society to do something essentially.
I think so. I think so. Because so much is even just the way you interact with the children around you, the kind of belief you hold them to, making sure that as adults, we're not setting a bar for kids that is too low, because I mean, kids have so many dreams and so much idealism, and how do we help fuel that and help them take the steps they need towards the future that they really want to create and the world that they want to create. And I would say the other thing that like everybody can do is just listen to children. I think it's one thing I talk a lot about, that in education, unlike in so many other sectors, we just don't ask kids. Like we don't ask them like, why does education matter? What do you want to learn? How do you want to learn? We just think we know better. And so we end up catering to not even the present, but the past in the way we design. Whereas if we just worked alongside our students and saw them not just as recipients of education, but drivers of their own education and the education of others, I think that could be a massive, massive shift.